Welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum, where we have conversations with experts and analysts on the latest geopolitical, economic, and cultural developments in Southeast Asia.
Good morning to listeners on Fulcrum. I'm Dr. William Choong, the managing editor of Fulcrum, the commentary and analysis website at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Today, we are very privileged to have with us Professor Aries Arugay, the coordinator of the Philippine Studies program here at ISEAS. Aries is also the professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines-Diliman. So, very warm welcome here, Aries, to Fulcrum, and thanks for taking the time, even then you're away from home, many thousands of kilometers away from home.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, William, and to your listeners. It's a pleasure to join this podcast and to engage in meaningful conversations about the Philippines and the larger region.
Yeah, thanks again, Aries. I mean, we were just talking pre the start of this podcast that you're coming to ICs. The starting up of the Philippine Studies program has been such a great benefit to ICs and also our wider audience and readers and listeners of both ICs as well as Fulcrum. So perhaps you want to tell us just a bit more about yourself and tell us a bit more about the Philippine Studies program, which is relatively new at ISEAS.
Sure thing. Uh, I'm Aries Arugay. My main hat is I'm an academic political scientist based in the University of the Philippines-Diliman. Tragically, I'm also chair of the Department of Political Science in the university, uh, at the administrative position that I will hold until early next year. Uh, I've been an academic for more than 20 years. And this is my 20th year as a regular faculty in the political science department. But apart from that, as you said, I started working for ICES way back in 2021 at the height of the pandemic. And back then, it was only the Philippine Studies Project. Was because of um, some level of support and funding given by the Philippine government through the Embassy of the Philippines in Singapore. And uh, I tried to track down why there is this, you know, generosity of support being given to Philippine studies. And I found out it came from um, congressional funding of a Senator Lauren Legarda, who I think visited ICES last year to sign, I would say, the third memorandum of cooperation between the Philippine government and ICES. And because of this funding support, the Philippine Studies Project lasted from 2021 until the end of the previous fiscal year. So you're correct. The Philippine Studies program was officially launched at the beginning of this fiscal year, April 2024, and it is the youngest country studies program in ICES. But it also, I think, is proof of the recognition of ICES, and I would think Singapore in general, of the increasing geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geostrategic importance and significance of the Philippines, not only in Southeast Asia but in the Pacific. So, in fact, this recognition that Philippine affairs should be something as a subject of focus is largely welcomed also here in the Philippines by local scholars and
Mm,
IC's publication platforms, Fulcrum Perspectives, IC's Perspectives, and the series of seminars and webinars we've had for the past 3 years was able to tap and as well as give some form of visibility and recognition to locally based scholars, because I do think that this is one of the amazing mandates that ICES provides. It's able to link region based scholars with those found within the country and somehow have meaningful engagement and conversations about pressing strategic, political,
mm,
economic, and even social cultural developments.
mm. I kind of agree with you more, Aries. I mean, just, I want to reiterate again, it's just, the advent of the Philippine Studies program has given us a lot more width and depth, and like you say, appreciation not only in the Philippines, but in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And I have to give you due credit that whenever somebody from the Philippine Studies project writes something about the Philippines and the wider region, is usually more often than not received quite warmly. Not only the fulcrums but the perspective. So, warm congratulations and well done. And I hope to have you with us for a long time yet, Eric.
Sure thing. I think I'm also very thankful because some of the Filipino scholars who've contributed to ISEAS platforms, they're quite known nationally, but somehow their voices in outside the country are not yet amplified. And ISEAS provides this very critical role of amplifying and resonating these voices that oftentimes you have to be in the country or at least uh, know the local network before you're able to tap the expertise and the specialist and this bridge building function of ICs that it does with other of its country studies programs is I think what sets it apart from
Hmm.
other research institutes, or you could even say think tanks that focus on on the same mandates or responsibility.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, great stuff. And yeah. Um, Now, Iris, let's talk about the topic at hand, which is the very reason why I suggested recording this podcast at this time. As you know, and you have written about it, the Philippines and Japan had recently signed a reciprocal access agreement, an RAA as they call it, on the 8th of July. Um, you've written a lot about it and you've spoken about it. Can you explain to our listeners what is the significance of this reciprocal access agreement, not only to the Philippines but to the wider region?
Right. Uh, Let me, if it's okay to give a
Sure,
backstory. Back in
sure.
2017, I was a visiting fellow at the Japan's Ministry of Defense think tank, the National Institute for Defense Studies.
Yeah.
And during my stint, I was looking into Philippine-Japan security cooperation. And back then, I was asking a lot from the MOD and then from my counterparts in Japanese academia, the prospects for some form of elevated defense security cooperation, likened to either a visiting forces agreement that the Philippines has
Mm,
with the United States, or the status of visiting forces agreement with Australia. And back then they were saying like, oh, this is not gonna happen. It's gonna be quite impossible. It's
mm,
gonna open uh, uh, sentiments and feelings, the old militarist pacifist
yeah,
debate in
yeah.
Japan. And in some way back home in the Philippines, there's this skepticism also because there's still this idea of Japan atrocities during the Second World War, and of course the idea of having foreign presence, military presence in the country invokes the Cold War years of having large military U.S. bases, and the Philippines being a springboard for military power projection in the region. Uh, so that was 2017. That's less than 10 years or 8 years even, and here we are. Uh, the two governments have signed a reciprocal access agreement, which is not quite like a visiting forces agreement because I don't think Japan uses that term like a BFA. It sticks with the idea that this agreement will be some form of a an arrangement of the rights and privileges of the Japanese troops when they're temporarily in another country to hold some form of military or defense exercises. So that jump from pure skepticism, even cynicism, to almost we're almost there, because the RAA needs ratification
Mm-hmm.
by both the Diet and the Philippine counterpart is the Senate. It's not going to be ratified by the entire Congress, but only by a 24-member body, the nationally elected Senate in the country. Uh, and in a way, this symbolized, I think, two things. One is at the level of Japan Philippine cooperation. A lot has changed since the end of the Second World War, and Japan continues to be a power that is positively evaluated by a lot of Filipinos, not because it's quite close to the US. I think Japan was able to carve its own as positive evaluation from the Filipino public, and this has something to do with its consistency in helping the Philippine economy. um, the large number of Filipinos who are able to work in Japan and be able to improve their lives, their well-being, contributes to such. And Japan has consistently been the largest provider of official development assistance in the Philippines. So you have a power that did not have any fleeting presence, and a lot of Filipinos didn't think that they have ulterior motives, and this is why Japan has been positively evaluated. I think these sentiments are not necessarily or equally shared by other Southeast Asian countries. uh, the second thing is, I think, of course, and this is normally the one that is used as a reason for the elevated security cooperation of countries in the region, would be the changing geopolitical strategic environment. And
Absolutely.
I do think that the increase in the number of regional flashpoints, of which Indonesia, countries in
Yes.
Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Japan all shares, heightened um, this need to work together more on defense and security. So you have that external impetus together with a conducive domestic environment on the part of the Philippines. And this is why you have an RAA. And this will make the country, the Philippines, possibly the closest strategic partner or country of Japan in the current in Southeast Asia thus far.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Aries. I think kind of just to summarize your 2 points, Japan's consistency and the changing geopolitical environment. I think it's just made it time is ripe, even for an RAA. And you were talking about Japan's overseas development assistance. If I'm not wrong, that's also developed into official security assistance as well.
Yes.
And the Philippines has been a beneficiary of that. If I'm not wrong, you've received some coastal surveillance radar from the Japanese. And I think this is a relationship that is on the upward trajectory.
Right.
Um, Now, it's just moving on. So with this ROA in place, and obviously it's something significant in light of what's happening in the geopolitical environment. Um, of course, the Philippines dispute with China on the South China Sea, or what you call the West Philippine Sea, if I to address our listeners in the Philippines. It's something that is really of paramount importance to the people of the Philippines. Now, how do you think this RAA with Japan will help in Manila's contest of wills with Beijing in the South China Sea?
Yeah. Just to maybe just clarify, because I had multiple times that I have to do this in local and national media in the Philippines. The Philippines uses the term West Philippine Sea, but it should not be equated to the South China Sea, because
Yeah,
the Philippines
yeah,
is not really claiming the entirety of. We don't
no,
have our own version of the 10 dash line. The West Philippine Sea only refers to the maritime zone of which the Philippines is entitled to, given UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and international law that includes the 2016 arbitral award that heavily favored the Philippines. So uh, when we perhaps we use it more locally to also symbolize that this is something that is within Philippine sovereignty, and or the Philippines has sovereign rights. And this term, the West Philippine Sea, actually started under the administration of former of then President Benigno Simeon Aquino, and this is some of the measures that were put in place. That includes all, of course, the launching of the case, um, the signing of the enhanced defense cooperation agreement with the United States, and I think with reference to Japan, it was during his government that the agreement to transfer military hardware was signed, and the Philippines was the first ASEAN country to do this. And since then, several other ASEAN countries followed suit. So I have this theory that the Philippines is always seems to be a test case. So Japan is, of course, a very reluctant power in
Yes.
the region, given history and given the way the Japanese
Yes.
does things. It's very careful. It's very gradual. It doesn't do knee jerk foreign policy. So the Philippines is the first to receive this military transfer agreement. The first, as Sibyun said, to receive official security assistance. Um, and now you have the RAA. I think this is a huge deal because it accomplishes several things. First, it further elevates Japan
Hmm.
Philippine security cooperation and rides on that momentum for several years. And this is regardless of the political leanings of the government in power, because even during the time of President Duterte, he has positive views about Japan's role in the region. And even if Duterte has anti-US sentiments, he did not necessarily have anti-Japanese
Hmm.
sentiments.
Hmm.
The only leader that he invited for lunch in his house in Davao City was then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah. So not even Xi Jinping was given that. I don't know if Xi Jinping would like that, but Prime Minister Abe had 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 shared a meal in Duterte's residence in his not in the palace, but for Duterte, the palace that's
Uh-huh.
regular, but to be
Uh-huh.
invited in his own personal home, in his own quote unquote fiefdom in Davao City, the only leader to be able to foreign leader to experience that. I think it's a testament of how the Philippines see Japan is trusting. And the current prime minister of Japan delivered an address to Congress a few was it last year or early this year, when he did a state visit. So I think this is a huge deal. It rides on that momentum. Second, um, while uh, Japan provides a lot of support militarily, it doesn't get the negative backlash that we you often get from the opposition, or the militant left in the Philippines that always sees, for example, U.S. presence negatively. So regardless of what happens, there will always be that anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, negative backlash every time there's an increase in Philippine-U.S. relations. There's not much, although of course there's still some sticky issues like the comfort women issue and other colonial atrocities, but I think there's also a generational shift. A lot of Filipinos now don't quite recall that era, and a lot of them are more focused on the image of Japan as a steady source of upward social mobility for the lives of Filipinos. And Japan's approach to defense and security cooperation has always been less conducted in a loud and
Yes.
blatant
Hmm.
manner. So it quietly and not so obviously provides military support, increasing maritime domain awareness of Philippine Coast Guard, for example, which is a huge deal because remember what happened in Scarborough Shoal in 2012 has also something, the standoff between China and the Philippines has also something to do with the weak capabilities of the Philippine Coast Guard. And while it's still being developed, I think Japan provided that huge boost. So I think this RAA will be a huge deal. It also tells us that under Marcos Jr., it doesn't mean that we will all put our strategic eggs in the US basket. And this diversification of security partnerships extends not only to our to the country that we have a mutual defense treaty with, but also with other like-minded states whom we share some concerns about regional flashpoints, including definitely the West Philippine Sea, but even including, for example, the Taiwan Strait, North Korea, and others. So, in other, just to end this long telling of the history between the two countries, you have mutuality, convergence of interest, but also a shared concern that the region is increasingly becoming turbulent, and while the U.S. is has credibly committed itself, it would be better to have uh, cooperation between the two countries, not necessarily always that it is always within the U.S. framework.
Mm. Thanks for that, Aries. I think can't agree with you more on Japan being a very dependable partner, and the word that you used was consistency. So to just to put a shameless self plug to ISEAS and the State of Southeast Asia survey. I mean, Japan is consistently the most trusted strategic partner among Southeast Asian respondents in the survey, including respondents from the Philippines. So thanks for that, Aries. Um,
Okay.
Now, I just want to talk about recent developments between China and Philippines, and we were discussing this just prior to this pod. Over the weekend on Sunday, it was reported that China and the Philippines had reached an understanding on a provisional agreement for resupply missions to second Thomas Shoal. As we know, it's been in the headlines.
Yeah.
And there was also at the ninth bilateral consultation mechanism meeting in Manila in July. It was agreed that the two countries will improve maritime communications, have discussions on cooperation between their coast guards, and they also discussed the convening of a forum comprising of scientists and academics on marine scientific and technology cooperation. Now, how do you view this areas? Will these somewhat soothe over the kind of altercations and conflicts that we've seen in the area in recent months?
Yeah. Uh, Thanks, William. This actually somehow deviates from developments between Philippine-China relations since Marcos Jr. visited China in February 2023. Because if you can trace um, uh, when Marcos visited in February 2023, after that visit, the transparency initiative of the Philippine government under his presidency
Yeah,
started,
yeah.
right? And somehow it really exacted a toll in Philippine-China relations. So
Mm-hmm.
that's almost a year and a few months since then, and given the many skirmishes, like from the laser to the
Yes, to the water
boys to the
cannons.
water cannoning to
Yeah.
the lost
Mhm.
finger of the Philippine personnel,
Yeah.
it has not been all hunky dory, as they would
Mm,
say
mm,
here in the
mm.
American South. Um, it's not all been nice and good between the Philippines and China, and what happened in June 17th somehow became a no pun intended, a watershed, in the sense that it's the height of tensions
Yeah.
thus far. So I do think that this series of more recent developments since June 17 somehow maybe became a wake-up call for China more than the Philippines, because not to defend the government of the day, they have always said, and the Philippines has always said, that communication lines and diplomatic lines are always open. Uh, it's just a matter of whether the more powerful country in this regard, in this regard, China, is willing to engage. So the BCM, the bilateral consultative mechanism meeting, it's a welcome development because the Philippines always says that we're open to talking, and but of course this all these diplomatic and communicative mechanisms require a certain level of strategic trust. And among other analysts, other observers of the region, I would say that we're not there yet in being able to rebuild some of the lost strategic trust, but this is a welcome development. Uh, we're still getting the details of this new agreement because at the moment all we have are the two statements from the two foreign ministries, right? We don't have a copy of what was actually agreed upon, or maybe the it's not put on paper, right? Because diplomacy is not affords us all these kinds of things that could not just be on paper. But it's quite interesting how there's some form of different interpretations of the agreement between China and the Philippines. And of course, both parties will try to spin, will try to interpret the agreement in accordance to their respective national interests. But I think, regardless of the varying perspectives, at least both countries somehow, this agreement symbolizes that both countries, there is this resolve to somehow rebuild some of the trust that has been lost. And new terms on how resupply missions will be conducted and how China will react, because it's
Mm,
been reacting, I would
mm,
say, quite disproportionately,
mm,
because other countries also commit the same incursions to it, to what it claims to be
mm.
its sovereign territory, but we don't necessarily see the same sentiment or the same reaction coming from mainland China. So I think this somehow, uh, at least, lessens
Mm,
the heat, the
mm,
tension between the two countries. Whether or not this will result to some form of a new a truce or of something remains to be seen. But I think this the Marcos government is also telling the region that we're not just following whatever external powers tell us to do with regard to the West Philippine Sea, to the South China Sea. And we see that uh, China is a power that needs to be engaged. And
mm.
so long as China wants to engage, the Manila will always be open to it. So it's a necessary critical step, but this is just we're just seeing the start. No, the agreement,
Mm,
I think, is just
mm,
a start,
mm.
and let us see what happens after. The Philippines has had prior experiences in dealing with China in this regard, so
Mhm.
there's some lessons that I hope this government will learn, and it will not go into another cycle with China, based on naivete or based on um, uh, some no idea of how China has behaved before. So I think it's important that the Philippine government remembers the long drawn history between
Absolutely.
dealing with China,
Yeah.
because if not, then we're just gonna repeat the same mistakes and that we've committed in the previous years.
Absolutely. I think the key with these kind of dispute maritime communication mechanisms is actually how well you actually use it. I mean, I studied like, the similar mechanisms between the Chinese and the Japanese on the Senkaku, so what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands is
Mhm.
it's a question of how well you use them, how much trust and significance you put into them. Because the Japanese will complain that we have the mechanism, but sometimes when we call the Chinese, they're not picking up the phone. I think the Americans will say the same thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I hope that, yeah, that
That
that will be,
actually happens
yeah.
with us, because this part before this agreement was signed during the BCM
Hmm.
meeting, there was this idea to have a hotline.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
that hotline existed already twice in Philippine-China relations. And the problem with hotlines, and I'm sure you know this uh, in your own research, is that uh, if the other party doesn't pick up, it doesn't work,
Yeah.
right? You can have a
Yeah.
hotline, but communication is always a two-way street. Someone has to
Yeah.
pick up the phone
Yeah.
because if not, it will just keep on ringing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think there was a PLA officers who told us that, there's a staff officer who pick up the phone, but in the Chinese military hierarchy, sometimes they don't always want to feed up the information up the chain of command, because the leader doesn't want to hear something that he doesn't want to hear. And so it's based on the political culture and the timing, the context of that mechanism.
Right,
So
right.
that's a great point, Aries. Now, moving on to a wider point, Aries, you know, just on this South China Sea dispute between the Philippines and China, if you listen to what a lot of ASEAN leaders are saying, it seems that the negotiation of the code of conduct, on the South China Sea is seen to be the holy grail, or something that is, something that is highly sought after and desired. So, just to give your take, Aries, do you think that we're going to see an eventual conclusion, if at all, in this code of conduct negotiations, and do you think it will be significant
Right.
in resolving some of the tensions in the area?
Yes. I don't know, William. You're the younger audience of this Fulcrum podcast may not remember, but uh, in 2002, the declaration on the conduct of parties was signed,
The
and
DOC,
the
yeah,
DLC is supposed to be the prequel, right, or the
yeah,
precursor, or some sort of a some form of a like a standby while a code of conduct, who everyone thought will be passed or will be agreed upon in a matter of years. I mean, 10 years went by, 15 years went by, 20 years went by, and now we're on the 22nd year, and we still don't see any COC. And I attended in that span. Me, William, you and me have attended so many track two,
too
so
many, too
many
many. Yeah,
conferences, too many Shangri-La dialogues
yeah, yeah,
on the South China Sea and the Code of Conduct. And a lot of us have already, I think, COC fatigue, right?
yeah.
We just want this to see the light of day so that we can move forward. That might be a very skeptical take on it, because but we all started as optimists. We wanted the COC to work, but it
Mm-hmm,
has, I think, overtaken by a lot of events. It has overtaken the power shifts in the region. It has overtaken how ASEAN, and pardon to those who still believe in ASEAN a lot. It has overshadowed the decrease in the saliency of ASEAN in the region, the relative decrease, and for some of us, from optimists, we're becoming more and more like pragmatic skeptics, meaning,
or even cynics.
yeah, or cynics. That's a diplomatic way of saying cynics. We just want this to be done so that we can explore other ways. So to just to be blunt, will this manage effectively manage disputes? I will be surprised if it does. If it does, then that's great. I'm
Yeah,
wrong, and I don't
I
really care
can't
if I'm
agree with you
wrong,
more, Iris. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But
Mm,
if it doesn't, and we put so much trust in it, then that means that the COC is simply a shell with nothing in it, nothing substantive. And
mm,
so far, the people we've talked to that have been somehow contributed to the negotiation is that the delay has something to do with how it was subjected to the ASEAN process.
mm-hmm,
It has been and the COC being used as a way to fend off other actors within the region. Particularly, it interprets the South China Sea more as a regional
mm,
within the regional context, rather than its global significance, in the way that other powers these powers might have less power asymmetry with China. but would have a contributing role to the stability of the South China Sea and the region. But the COC possibly could be an obstruction to their ability to perform this stabilizing role. All puts the COC
mm,
process
mm,
highly suspect, but highly suspect also is not only the current process, because under the Duterte administration, the Philippines even became the coordinator for ASEAN China relations.
mm,
That would
mm,
have been the opportunity, because you have a very Beijing friendly government in the Philippines to somehow push for the ASEAN Code of Conduct. But 6 years has passed under Duterte. He promised, kind of
mm,
promised to deliver this, but of course, it's not just up to him in the Philippines. This is between, unfortunately, between ASEAN members, all 10, and China. So,
mm,
my long rant about the COC is that I will just be glad for it to end, so that at least countries that have hugely invested on this, including my country, can
mm,
then explore for other ways, because a lot of us here in Manila are highly skeptical that this will be substantive enough to solve, not even solve, because to manage the tensions and the disputes within the South China
mm.
Sea.
Thanks for that, Aries. I think to sum up, I think we've been around long enough. We both want to see the code of conduct kind of resolved or negotiations to conclude. But in the meantime, we're not putting all our store
Yeah.
in it.
It's
So
a sunk
yeah,
investment. I mean, it's like we can't exit. We wanted to see it, but exit is not an option because we're just in too deep, right?
yeah, yeah,
So we
yeah,
just want to see it, so that at least our investment, whether
yeah,
we feel it's a loss investment, but you know,
yeah.
exiting it entails more cost, so we're basically stuck.
Thanks for that great summary, Aries. Now I'm just going to ask another question, and this is the million-dollar question, Aries. We've been seeing as you know, you've written a lot about all these big ships in the region. We spoke about Japan's bigger security role. We see intensified Sino-American rivalry, and now we are seeing a growing China-Russia axis in the region that's coming through North Korea and South Korea. Um, and of course, we've seen over the weekend, the U.S. elections and the possibility of a Trump a second Trump administration, at least a possibility of it. Now, how do you see this affecting the Philippines going forward? I mean, all credit to the current government. I think has done all the right things in terms of beefing up your security posture and position. But how do you think all these big ships are going to affect Manila going forward?
Right. I do think, when President back then, when Ferdinand Marcos Jr. ran for the presidency,
Mm,
not many were optimistic about his foreign
mm,
policy if he became president, because he campaigned on the idea that he will just continue what Duterte's foreign policies were, which for us were like, oh no, this is gonna be a disaster, because
mm,
Duterte's foreign policy adventures basically pulled the Philippines out of its conventional foreign policy positions and made it less dependable, less reliable. I mean,
mm,
while Duterte wanted to somehow revise foreign policy, but he didn't really understand how rooted Philippine foreign policy is on
mm,
values, how rooted it is in its identity as a nation. Marcos Jr., of course, campaigned to continue, but it was only, I think, a political tactic in order to get the supporters of Duterte to vote for him.
mm,
So when he became president and he started recalibrating and reshifting Philippine foreign policy back to its more conventional mode, I do think that this was largely welcome,
mm,
because Filipinos are not so used to the way that Duterte conducts his foreign policy. Uh, in other words, Marcos's foreign policy is dictated by the increasing turbulence in the region, the increasing uncertainty by the Sino-American geopolitical rivalry. Then you have Russia, uh,
Mm.
Russian presence. Then you have all these regional flashpoints, and definitely, I think for the Marcos Jr. administration, you're correct in what you said. It's doing everything that it can
Mm.
control. So in a way, domestically can control. It can still improve a lot in having foreign policy coherence of the entire government. So there's still some deviation from having a single voice, which I think is of critical importance because we're a messy and flawed democracy. So sometimes you will
To put it
have
lightly.
yeah, to put it lightly. So sometimes you'll have these like the June 17th incident. There were different versions, and I said
Yeah.
like this cannot be because politics stops at the water's edge. So
Mm.
you
Mm.
have a coherent and unified voice in foreign policy when you engage countries like China and other powers in the region. So I think the Marcos Jr. administration is on top of this, but we all know that fortune or the lack of it is an important element in foreign policy and international affairs. Marcos can only do so much in terms of what it can control, but whether or not Sino-American rivalry will dissipate or will lessen, Russia will be a bit more responsive. All of these are beyond the Philippines'
Absolutely. Yeah.
control as a
Yeah.
small state. So, at best, it can do whatever it can, but it must also prepare for the worst. So, the Philippines, for just to give an example, the Philippines, among all Southeast Asian countries, is at the front line if something happens in the Taiwan Strait.
Mm.
And this is why Marcos had to do something and had to recalibrate the offer of the United States to help.
Mm.
Uh, you have new EDCA sites, and these
Yeah.
were sites where U.S. military could have rotational presence in Philippine military facilities. New places were put near the Taiwan island because you have 220,000 Filipinos living in Taiwan.
Mhm.
And to repatriate those just in case the worst case scenario happens will be the biggest mobilization of overseas Filipinos in the history of the
Mhm.
country. So that is something that a lot of people in Marxist government are losing sleep trying to plan for that contingency. So therefore, Marcos is doing everything that it can, but it also knows that Philippine-U.S. relations have ebbs and flows, meaning the possibility of a Trump 2.0 is a big uh, could be potentially damaging to the rekindled alliance between the Philippines and the U.S. if we base how Trump 1.0
Yeah.
behaved, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
basically under Trump, the U.S. was a non-entity
Mm.
as far as the alliance with the Philippines is concerned. In fact, Biden revitalized
Yeah.
and rekindled that alliance. So, and this is why for the Marcos government, okay, there's that threat of the U.S. again disappearing in the region under Trump 2.0. So we have to have our plan B, our plan C. So I think this push to rope in other powers to somehow institutionalize this new trilateral between the Philippines, Japan, and the United States, um, these comprehensive partnerships. I know there's word that there will be other visiting forces agreements being signed with countries like Canada, France. Um, there have been talks of elevated security cooperation with other like minded states who did not really bother exploring this before with the Philippines. So I think for now, Marcos is doing whatever it can. It's somehow anticipating possible implications of the changes in US domestic politics given the elections. But at the end, it can only do so much. It really will depend on how other factors beyond its control will unfold in the coming months and years. But that only means that the work is cut out for Marcos and the government and its national security planners. But we also hope that the last thing the region needs is conflict at the moment, because we've seen how it has affected the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel invasion of Gaza, and all of these, and therefore having a flashpoint becoming an actual point of conflict within our part of the world will be the worst possible case scenario, not only for the Philippines but for everyone.
Thanks, Aries. I think I'm sorry to burden you with essentially $1 million question, which you basically had 5 minutes to answer. But I think you've answered it, superbly. The way you answered it, and talking about possible partnerships between the Philippines, Canada, and France, and possibly even the United Kingdom. Who knows?
Yeah.
I think that would be another kind of piece of evidence to show that the Marcos Jr. administration is actually doing everything possible in its power to cement Manila's position in the changing geopolitical context. And so thanks again for your time, Aries. I think time has flown during our podcast. And if anything, everything that we've discussed in the past 40 or so minutes, it means more work for all of us, more work to research, more work to talk about, more work to write about. So thanks again, Aries. It's been a truly enjoyable time, and wishing you all the best for what you're doing, where you are, and hope to see you again.
Sure. Thank you again, Willem, for the kind invitation, and of course, looking forward to continuing to work on Philippine affairs with ISEAS and the wonderful team of all of you there in Singapore.
Thank you, Aries. And here's wishing a very good morning to all our listeners. And let's continue to read and listen to Fulcrum.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation on Dialogues at Fulcrum. If you want to access more of our analysis on Southeast Asia, please check out fulcrum.sg. Dialogues at Fulcrum is brought to you by the ISEAS Youth of Asia Institute. We look forward to sharing more insightful conversations with you in subsequent episodes. See you then!